In this video lesson, we'll cover the Battle of Antietam and the Emancipation Proclamation. Robert E. Lee, broken the McClellan's assault on Richmond, next moved northward. At the Second Battle of Bull Run, which was August 29 to 30th, 1862, Lee encountered a Federal force under John Pope. Lee quickly gave him a front view, attacking his troops and inflicting a crushing defeat to the bragging Pope. Emboldened by this success, Lee daringly thrust into Maryland into what he had hoped to strike a blow that would not only encourage foreign intervention by Britain or France, but also seduce the still wavering border states and its sisters from the Union. But the Marylanders did not respond, as the presence among the invaders of so many blanketless, hatless, and shoeless soldiers dampened the state's ardor. Events finally converged towards a critical battle at Antietam Creek in Maryland. Lincoln, unyielding to popular pressure, restored George McClellan. Two Union soldiers found a copy of Lee's battle plans wrapped around a packet of 3 cigars, dropped by a careless Confederate officer. So they had crucial intelligence. McClellan succeeded in halting Lee at Antietam in one of the bitterest and bloodiest battles of the war. Although Lee retired across the Potomac, McClellan was removed from his filed command, and he didn't gain much. So basically, even though McClellan had the plans in his hand, he was unable to defeat Lee at Antietam. His numerous critics condemned him for not having boldly pursued Lee and allowing Lee to escape across the Potomac River. The landmark Battle of Antietam was one of the decisive engagements in world history. Jefferson Davis was perhaps never again so near victory as on the day of the Battle of Antietam. Throughout this video, you'll also see pictures. This is the first war that we will actually have pictures, and the majority of them were taken by a man named Matthew Brady, who was the creator of photojournalism. So all the pictures you see in the videos are actual pictures from the battle sites. The French and British governments were on the verge of diplomatic mediation. An almost certain rebuff by Washington might well have spurred Paris and London into armed collusion with Richmond, but both capitals cooled off after the Union's display. Bloody Antietam provided Lincoln with the long-awaited opportunity to launch the Emancipation Proclamation. Even though Antietam technically was not a Union win, he's going to use it as a win to be able to launch the Emancipation Proclamation. The abolitionists were very, very impatient and wanted Lincoln to do something. Congress had already decreed in 1861 that rebel property used in the war effort, including slaves, could be confiscated. A second Confiscation Act in 1862 punished traitors by declaring their slaves captives of war who shall be forever free. Lincoln hesitated to go further at that point, while the loyalty of the border states was in doubt, and while the North's military fortunes seemed so uncertain against the South. By the summer of 1862, he was ready. The wavering states had come safely into the Union fold, and he needed a solid victory of arms so that he could proclaim emancipation from a position of military strength. So he awaited the outcome of Lee's invasion. Antietam served as a needed emancipation springboard, and on September 23, 1862, the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation was issued by Lincoln, and the document announced that on January 1, 1863, the President would issue a final proclamation. On the scheduled date, he fully redeemed his promise, and the Civil War became more of a moral crusade as the fate of slavery and the South it had sustained was sealed. The war now became more of what Lincoln called a remorseless revolutionary struggle. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 declared forever free the slaves in the Confederate States still in rebellion. Bondsmen in the loyal border states were not affected, nor were those in specific conquered areas in the South. The proclamation was an act of justice calling for the considerate judgment of mankind and the gracious favor of Almighty God. The presidential pen did not formally strike the shackles from a single slave, because it only freed the slaves in the states that were in rebellion, the Confederate states, and they were no longer taking orders from Abraham Lincoln. Where Lincoln could have presumably freed the slaves, that is, in the border states, He refused to do so because he didn't want to cause them to want to break away from the Union. The Emancipation Proclamation was stronger basically on proclamation than it was on emancipation during that time period. Yet much unofficial do-it-yourself liberation did begin to take place as a result. Thousands of jubilant slaves in the South, learning of the proclamation, flocked to the invading Union armies, stripping already run-down plantations off their workforce. In this sense, the Emancipation Proclamation was heralded by the drumbeat of running feet, but many fugitives would have come anyhow, as they had from the war's outset. Lincoln's immediate goal was not only to liberate the slaves, but also to strengthen the moral cause of the Union at home, and this he succeeded in doing. At the same time, Lincoln's proclamation clearly foreshadowed the ultimate doom of slavery. This was legally achieved by the action of individual states and by the ratification of the 13th Amendment in 1865, 8 months after the Civil War had ended. The Emancipation Proclamation also fundamentally changed the nature of the war because it effectively removed any chance of a negotiated settlement. Public reactions to the long-awaited proclamation were varied. Many abolitionists complained that Lincoln had not gone far enough. On the other hand, large numbers of Northerners, especially in the butternut regions of the Old Northwest and border states, felt that he had gone too far. Opposition mounted in the North against supporting an abolition war. Many boys in blue, especially from the border states, had volunteered to fight for the Union, but not against slavery, and so desertions are going to increase rapidly. The crucial congressional elections in the autumn of 1862 went heavily against administration, particularly in New York, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. The Emancipation Proclamation caused an outcry to rise from the South that Lincoln the Fiend was trying to stir up the hellish passions of a slave insurrection. Aristocrats of Europe, noting that the proclamation applied only to rebel slaveholders, were inclined to sympathize with Southern protests, but the Old World working classes, especially in Britain, reacted and supported the Union. They sensed that the proclamation spelled the ultimate doom of slavery, and many laborers were more determined than ever to oppose intervention and to make sure that Britain did not get involved in the Civil War. The North now had a much stronger moral cause. In addition to preserving the Union, it had committed itself to freeing the slaves, and the South's moral position will begin to diminish. As Lincoln moved to emancipate the slaves, he also took steps to enlist African Americans into the armed forces. The regular army contained no African Americans at the war's outset, and the War Department refused to accept those free Northern blacks who tried to volunteer. But as manpower ran low and emancipation was proclaimed, African American enlistees began to be accepted, sometimes over ferocious protests from Northern as well as Southern whites. By war's end, some 180,000 African Americans served in the Union armies, most of them from the slave states, but many from the Free Soil North. 10% of the enlistments from the Union forces on land and sea included 2 Massachusetts regiments, one of them being the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, in which 2 sons of Frederick Douglass served. African American fighting men also had their hearts in the war against slavery, now that the Civil War had become about proclaimed emancipation. African American fighters earned 22 Congressional Medals of Honor, the highest military award, and their casualties were extremely heavy. More than 38,000 died. Many were captured and put to death as slaves in revolt, for not until 1864 did the South recognize them as prisoners of war. We'll talk about Fort Pillow a little more in class, as well as the Tennessee surrender and massacre. For reasons of pride, prejudice, and principle, the Confederacy could not bring itself to enlist slaves until a month before the war ended, and by then it was too late. Meanwhile, tens of thousands were forced into labor battalions, the building of fortifications, the supplying of armies, and other war-connected activities. Slaves were the stomach of the Confederacy and kept the farms going while the white men fought. Ironically, the great mass of Southern slaves did little to help their Northern liberators. Through the grapevine, the African Americans learned of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. The bulk of them, whether because of fear, loyalty, lack of leadership, or strict policing, did not cast off their chains, but tens of thousands revolted when they abandoned their plantations upon the approach or the arrival of the Union armies. We'll discuss more about the slave rebellions and the impact of the Emancipation Proclamation in our classroom discussions.